All right. Well, chapters 3 and 4 of A Grief Observed. Perhaps I should just start by asking, was there anything that stood out to you that you wanted to just make note of off the top? Okay. Ooh, and Tash, we have the same edition.
The big thing for me was, and I'm not sure if it's in chapter 3 or 4, but his house of cards analogy that, we don't realize how fragile our faith is, how thin, how weak, whatever words you want to put on it, until you're really slammed with something.
Right. Yes. Is there any commentary you wanted to make on that notion?
It just really had me reflecting a lot.
Okay, yeah.
Because, truthfully, I mean, yes, I've been through some things, but not like that.
Right.
That's
so
interesting.
Where am I really,
Yes.
Yeah.
Carol?
I think that's interesting, Mary, because I think I've experienced one of the harder things to lose, and it didn't. I didn't experience a cards of faith collapsing. I almost wished they would, because I found it hard to be in so much pain and know that God was still there and he was suffering too. And part of me just wanted to yell, well, why the hell did you do this thing? So I didn't experience cards of faith collapsing.
Okay.
It was a different
And
kind
again,
of
of course, everything I'm reading reminds me of my brother.
Yeah. Everything
It certainly did collapse. They're flattened. There's nothing left.
Yeah.
Although I think he's making baby steps back. Just little things that he's said and done lately.
Yeah.
Kind of give me some hope.
Good.
Are you hearing in Lewis's notion that this is a part of God's grace, not allowing us to build a faith that is really just a house of cards, but is determined to help us to build a faith that is solid and real?
Yes, definitely.
Good. I thought his opening of chapter 3 was interesting. So, something in the last number of years that I've been thinking of is when I was younger, I would have an idea and kind of set it out. I don't know, it might be in conversation, might just be in private reflection, but I would draw some sort of a conclusion. And then anything that came after that, that seemed to be different, seemed to be a contradiction and maybe less true. But as I get older, I find that why is the first thought more real or more true than further thought? And it seems to me that's part of Lewis's experience in this. As he opens up chapter 4, he has said things in chapters 1 and 2. Now he just outright contradicts himself. He says, it's not true that I'm always thinking of H. And, so it seems to me at the time that he wrote the earlier statement, I'm always thinking of her. That's just as true as this. Actually, I'm not always thinking of her. The reality is that there are times when I don't think of her, and instead I just have in the background this sense of something's wrong and I'm not sure why. And I thought that was interesting about grief, that it can't be at the maximum volume all the time, even though it feels like in maybe some of the first throes or maybe at different points in the grief experience, it does seem so all-consuming.
And he does talk about how you come back to these things too. Like
Yes,
grief is a circle almost.
right.
There's like, I've heard people talk about there's the 8 stages of grief or whatever it is. And
Yep.
you could be at any one point at any one time, but you could go back to the beginning or skip to the end or
Yeah, it's not
go to
linear.
the middle. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that confuses a lot of people.
right.
Like they don't understand what's happening to them.
Right. When again, we're kind of as human beings geared toward the status quo. We want things to be all right. And we work
Mhm.
really hard at getting them there. So even as we pay attention to our own grief, I think for the people around us and for ourselves, there's a sense of, oh, good. They seem to be getting better. Or I
Yes.
seem to be getting better. And then there's the gut punch again.
I like to where Lewis drew the parallel of H's pain and then, but his suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just read a little bit. It says, it is harder than I think was hers. What is grief compared with physical pain? Whatever fools may say, the body may suffer 20 times more than the mind.
Mm-hmm.
The mind always has some power to evasion. At worst, the unbearable thought only comes back and back, but the physical pain can be absolutely continuous. Grief is like a bomb circling round and dropping its bombs every time the circle brings it overhead. Physical pain is like the steady barrage on a trench in World War I, hours of it with no let up for a moment. Thought is never static. Pain often is.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So again, the mind, he was, his mind is troubled.
Yes.
Yeah, that was one of the passages I picked out. I'm not sure I agree with him. I'm not sure that physical pain is worse than emotional pain. Probably his experience of emotional pain was less. I don't think that's true for everybody.
Just the body can suffer 20 times more.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought Bob had, what in his reading was saying that the grief was worse than the physical pain, the emotional pain.
No,
was
he's
worse than
not saying that, and that's a little.
The body can suffer 20 times more than the mind.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I thought that was, perhaps him. But then in that section, he goes on to say, he's calling, it sounds as if he's struggling with self-centeredness. He's calling out to God to bring his wife back. And that's a useless thing to do. But even if it weren't, why on earth would you want her to have to come back to go through the pain and the death again? That really, for the person who's died, they're in good shape. And to ask the Lord to return them, even for a moment, is not thinking about the person.
That seems to be the paragraph that says, what sort of a lover am I to think so much about my affliction and so
Yeah.
much less about hers? So that's page 47 in mine.
Okay, it's page 34 in mine.
Yeah, I want her back as an ingredient in the restoration of my past.
Right.
Yeah.
That ain't gonna happen. Like you said, Carol, you're wishing for something that can't be.
And
if
it
it
wouldn't be
happened,
good
it'd be
for the
horrendous.
person who's died.
It would be horrendous if it happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm sure the person wouldn't thank you.
Oh, and that's the
Right.
quote that Humbert had brought forward last week. Hadn't Lazarus the raw deal?
Yeah.
Yep.
So he recognizes that there's something selfish. He describes that as the insane call, come back. It's really about his past. It's not about her, her benefit. Which might tell us something about even the way that we love each other, right? We may be unable to escape some level of selfishness in loving other people.
For me, these last couple chapters of this book, it seemed to me that he was really trying to pinpoint what grief is.
Yes,
And he's trying to come up with a definition, and he can't. He never really does. And so he asks a lot of questions. Like there is a lot of question marks that I saw in here, more than the first half.
right.
And I found that interesting too, that he's really in his mind, he's especially going through what happens after a little bit has passed. Like when I'm still grieving, but what happens after? Like, do I forget her? Do I, like he's wrestling here with,
Mhm.
yeah. That's,
Yes. And I think that as I was reading through chapter 4 in particular, both letters to Malcolm, and I think Great Divorce is after this, like chronologically in terms of his writing. And I think some of the stuff he's reflecting on, he then starts to work out in that imaginative way in Great Divorce. And if you remember in Letters to Malcolm, he makes some references to some of what he experienced in the passing of Joy.
yeah, like even at the beginning when he says, does grief really subside into boredom tinged by faint nausea?
Mhm. What page are you on?
41.
41, okay.
It doesn't seem to occur to him that it could evolve into something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he's in that space of grief where he can't see anything but grief.
Right. Though I suppose that if grief evolved into something else, then it would still cease to be grief.
Yes, probably.
Yeah, that was interesting, eh? Does it finally subside into boredom tinged by faint nausea?
I don't think we ever stop grieving. For myself, I find moments of total forgetfulness, like I've forgotten them altogether.
Right.
And then, there was, it was a while ago now, but I was walking to the bus stop to go play bridge. So this was like at least 3 or 4 years ago. And we used to go out every Thanksgiving together, red maple leaves for my Annie Lil, because she lived out west and they didn't have them out there, and she really loved them. So we go and get some, and we wax them and send them to her. And I come around the corner and there's these beautiful red maples. I lost it, you know, and I mean, was more than 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
So little things like that, at least for me, that's my experience.
Yeah.
You know, be long periods where I don't think about them at all. And then some little thing will remind me of them. And
But is
I'll
it,
feel that sadness again, you know.
does it trigger an element of love though? That's what I come to my mind right away, just the way you said it, because something they really loved, and you've seen that, and it's just love exploded.
So do you see grief, as Lewis is describing it, as separate than love?
Well, I'll think about that, but I was just thinking of Mary's example. That's what it means.
Yeah.
The trigger immediately was something kind that you did, and it's loving. It was a good thing. And but it, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm authentically asking the question just because it sounds like there's some division in your thinking between, was that because Mom had named that as grief?
But it's love too. I
Right.
think it's
Well,
both things.
and I have to think that grief is rooted in love. I mean, we don't grieve for those we don't love, right? Like I can feel sad about a school shooting. I can think it's horrific.
Yeah.
I can grieve about the event, but I'm not necessarily grieving for people, or even if they put a face on it, you know, this little girl was shot, that, you know, I can grieve for that little girl in that moment, but almost 30 years later, I'm not going to see a leaf and be triggered in that same way, right? Like it seems to me grief is love. Grief is what occurs when love separates. And I think that's what Lewis talked about in the first two chapters. You know, it's this total separation. I cannot follow. We are, you know, even if we both died at the same time, one is gone, one is stayed, you know, whatever the scenario is, it's only grievous because he loves her. And to see the red maple leaf is to be reminded in that moment of the one that you love, and to remember afresh maybe the total separation at his death. And again, to grieve afresh, but certainly not in the same way, I would think, as
No,
when you first lost her, right?
no. Actually, that was probably, I won't say the first time I cried, but close to that, because I wasn't with her when she passed away. She was living out west. I did travel there, and I went to help my cousin who she lived with to, you know, sort through her stuff and things like that. And I gave a eulogy and so on. But I think I was walking around in a big fog
Right.
and was numb, you know,
Yeah.
at the beginning.
Yeah. Which is itself a part of grief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My aunt was more like my mother to me, so, than my mother.
So what we've just named sounds like this declining of the intensity of grief is matching to some degree what Lewis is describing in the beginning of chapter 3. It would seem that we can't always have it so fresh. It can't always be so raw. At some point, even against our wills, maybe it begins to decline in terms of intensity.
He goes on, he went on to say a little later in that chapter, bereavement is a universal and integral part of our experience of love.
Say it again.
Bereavement is a universal and integral part of our experience of love.
Mm-hmm.
I found that fascinating because I think he's absolutely right, but I'd never thought about it before. That you can't have love. Ultimately, bereavement has to be part of the experience of love.
Mhm.
So in the experience of love, you can have the honeymoon stage, you can have the ups and downs of relationship, you can have whatever, but ultimately it's going to end with bereavement.
Mhm.
Um,
And maybe there's smaller bereavements in the regular course of love too. And, I'm thinking about when we set off for Saskatchewan, right? There was
Yeah.
bereavement there for people that we left behind in Ontario.
Yeah, we try not to dwell on that too much.
Oh, we have this wonderful Zoom. Mom, I notice on page 43, he talks about bridge players again. You just can't
Yes,
get away from it.
he was referring to them a few times. Yeah,
There
little more
has to be money in the game.
a little bit more positively this time.
There has to be money in the game.
I was also interested when he was talking about bereavement being part of the love experience, when he was saying that he believes, he thinks, I'm not quite sure which it is, that the dead one also feels the pain of separation.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought, what would he base that on theologically?
Well, I think he was exploring the idea. I don't remember him making a all-out statement, but I think he was to some degree speculating and wondering if we don't lose ourselves completely in the heavenly realm, then there must be some degree of separation and the sense of separation for the other person as well.
Well, that ties in with his belief, I think, from the book we read before, Screw Tape Letters in Small Group.
Okay.
What's the name of which I can't remember.
In small group before Screw Tape Letters, it was Great Divorce.
Great. So when he was talking about, I wasn't quite with him when he was talking about I believe the early stages of moving into heaven,
Yeah,
where you would take more of your earthliness with you
right.
and more of your
Wonderful.
personhood as an earthly being rather than a heavenly being,
Right.
almost a purgatory kind of a state. And it struck me that this kind of fits in with that.
Right. Yeah.
An in-between position that he describes in the book.
Yeah.
That you would experience the feeling of separation.
Yeah.
I personally have never thought that,
Yeah.
but I've always had a theology of a very strong cutoff between heaven and earth,
Right.
not a transitional thing. So it's really made me wonder.
Right.
I've got a quote that Lewis used about heaven. We often think of heaven as less real and less substantial than life here and now. Hence, we don't think of heaven as a place where people will hug, and certainly not in these bodies. But in heaven, we won't be shadow people living in shadow lands. That's to borrow Lewis's imaginary. Instead, we will be fully alive and fully physical in a fully physical universe.
Yeah.
I think he did have some belief in purgatory. He kind of references it a little bit here and there.
Yeah.
And I'd like to come back to that. But the other thing I wanted to say that struck me reading this was how the first two chapters he talked about how, I'm praying, my wife is dying, I'm praying, and it just feels like God slammed the doors, put the bar down, and walked away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now he's saying, I've been gradually coming to feel that the door is no longer shut and bolted.
Yeah.
Was it my frantic need that slammed it in my face?
Right. Yeah, that was some interesting ideas because he played
Mm.
around with that idea for a bit, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, the time when there is nothing at all in your soul except a cry for help may be just the time when God can't give it. You are like the drowning man who can't be helped because he clutches and grabs. Perhaps your own reiterated cries deafen you to the voice you hoped to hear. I found that very interesting.
Yes.
It's a transition.
Yes.
Yeah, I love the imagery that he presents if you keep going there, and it says, knock and it shall be opened. But does knocking mean hammering and kicking the door like a maniac?
The maniac. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, just to follow that, he says on 54, you must have a capacity to receive, or even omnipotence can't give.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's that refusal to lose sight of a real human person and situation, even in the face of the power of God. God is not going to destroy us by trying to give us something we can't receive. There has to be capacity. And so part of what God must be about is some capacity building in us, which again
He knows
is
us.
painful and kind of like what Carol was talking about and Mom earlier about purgatory, that there's this. So John Wesley put it this way: justification gives us the right to heaven. Sanctification makes us fit for heaven. And the ultimate destiny is glorification. And so for Lewis, he sees that there has to be some sort of a process and get us from here to there. Even if we were to say it happens in an instant, that instant is still a measure of time. There was a time when we weren't fit for heaven and a time when we will be made fit for heaven. Even if that is a moment, who knows from our side of things how long that moment feels or you know what I mean? And it must have some degree of pain to it, to let go of something and to grab hold of something. And Lewis's master, George MacDonald, writes a book called, I can't remember, I think it's in his book, Lilith. He does a lot of coming of age kind of stories using fantasy as a genre. And so there's one young man who inherits his father's house, and he kind of enters into this other type of world, this fantastic world full of phantasms. And he is brought to this house of the dead, and he's told to lay down on this cold slab and go to sleep. And that all he has to do is just lay down and die. And when he opens his eyes, he'll have life. But he's keenly aware that if he lays down, he's laying down his life. And that is the call. And of course he resists, and that's part of the story. And finally he comes and lays on the stone, closes his eyes, and is covered, and an instant later is awoken by a voice calling his name. But that again talks about that the need, the laying down of our own lives. And again, we'll see it in Great Divorce, right? let me remove this creature from you that's corrupting you. You will be better and happier if you let me. Well, why didn't you just do it? Well, I can't do it against your will. Is it going to hurt? It feels like you're going to kill me. Oh, it's going to hurt intensely, but it's the only cure for you. It's the only way to go on, right? So nothing is done against our will, and something has to be done. We must. Again, like Don Treader and Eustace, we have to undress to be washed, to receive the new life, to become undragoned. Only we can't do it ourselves. We need the deeper, bigger, better claws that go right into the heart. But even that, there's pain, right? So we got some themes going on here.
Yeah, I love that. That God enables capacity building. Love that. Somebody should write that down.
It's being recorded. I mean, they'll never forget my words.
Capacity building within us. Yeah.
Did you also make the note that it's painful? The
Yeah.
capacity building?
Yes.
Because that's probably the key thing to make note of. Sounds wonderful to say God builds capacity in us, but if we don't remember that that is a terribly painful process that we're likely to be running from, again, because we want the status quo.
We like being comfortable.
Yes.
I remember when Ron was dying, and he died over a period of many years, but sort of 10 years was pretty intensive. And in those years, there came a time I was railing against God. I was angry. I was all kinds of things. But there came a time when I realized that I had stopped praying for Ron to recover and had started praying for Ron to die.
Mm.
And that I didn't register making the shift. But the minute I realized I had made the shift, I was horrified.
Right.
And it was incredibly painful. Because we got to the point where I wanted him dead. I didn't want him living this way. But to realize that that was true
Right.
was just an enormous thing to live with.
And I think that kind of echoes what we saw last time in the first two chapters. To just say that the person is going to God is no help
Yes.
in that situation. It's still awful.
Mhm.
Your love is being separated.
I think I am beginning to understand why grief feels like suspense. It comes from the frustration of so many impulses that had become habitual. Thought after thought, feeling after feeling, action after action had H for her object. Now their target is gone. I keep on through habit, fitting an arrow to the string. Then I remember and have to lay the bow down. So many roads led thought to H. I set out on one of them, but now there's an impassable frontier post across it. So many roads once, now so many cul-de-sacs.
Mhm.
He also talks about how, you know, when you're married, the two become one flesh.
Yes,
And the way he sort of takes that a bit further, he talks about it's like someone cut off my leg, and perhaps one day I'll get a wooden leg, but I shall never be a biped again.
yes. I thought that was a wonderful, because he contrasted it, right? He said there's the procedure of the appendix, or there's the procedure of the leg being amputated. And I thought that was very insightful. You know, trying to imagine, we're coming up to 25 years of marriage, Sarah and I. And as Lewis is writing about that lost leg, I was trying to think, can I even imagine my life at this point without Sarah? How would everything is so tied up with her. Yeah. I thought it was a very good illustration.
And I like the analogy because he talks about how the stump of your leg will intermittently through the years be painful.
Right.
Mm,
It will never be restored.
Yes.
This isn't a healing.
Yes.
And I thought that's so true. That's what grief is. And when
Right.
you least expect it, like the maple leaves, Mary, it comes back again.
Yeah.
mhm,
Not as with as much impact, but maple leaves will probably always twinge you in some way.
mhm. Yeah, and there's other things for other people. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
There's just
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this, in my version, it's on page 61. But of course, one must take sent to try us the right way. God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't. In this trial, he makes us occupy the dock. That is, we are on trial. We're the witness box and the bench all at once. So we're the judge, jury, and accused. He always knew that my temple was a house of cards. His only way of making me realize that fact was to knock it down. So we talked about that earlier.
Mhm.
That's again his omnipotence.
Mhm. Still, there's no denying that in some sense I feel better. And with that comes at once a sort of shame and a feeling that one is under a sort of obligation to cherish and foment and prolong one's unhappiness. I've read about that in books, but I never dreamed I should feel it myself. I'm sure H wouldn't approve of it. She'd tell me not to be a fool. So I'm pretty certain what is behind it. So that starting to feel better and then to feel bad about feeling better.
And the reverse of that, David, is what he starts out chapter 4 with,
Yes.
when he says that I am out of notebooks.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm over my grief. I'm not going to write about it anymore, because if I keep writing about it, grief has a history rather than an event.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if I keep feeding its history, my grief is just going to go on forever.
Right.
I'm not buying another notebook.
And he talks about it as an arbitrary stopping point.
Yes, definitely. There has to
And
be
I
a
don't know that he's saying the end of his grief, certainly the end of his reflection on his own
on
grief.
its grief, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't think that's true. I think you will reflect on it again, but I think that's a statement of healing
Yes.
when you
Yes.
start to get tired of your grief.
Right. Yeah.
And it's very hard to say, I'm tired of writing about H all
Right.
the time. I'm ready
Yeah.
to do something else without running out of notebooks as the reason.
Yeah. I also think there's some wisdom there for us. And again, we'll see it in Great Divorce, where we can make that fomenting of grief, we can make that our character, our place to dwell, and it becomes monstrous. We'll encounter that in a few different ways in Great Divorce. Some of these things that we do to ourselves as human beings just prevent us from actually pursuing the life of God. We would rather hold on to our grief than to lay it down in order to move forward and move further in and further up and or to have a God. So he sees some, in part at least, vanity in his own grief, wanting to prove himself as a grand lover or a tragic hero.
He is English. You have to give him space.
Well, again, I think that there's some good insight and warning for us. Okay, well, let's move into chapter 4. Insofar as this record was a defense against total collapse. So he had a sense of why he started writing all of this stuff. He was on the verge and it became a safety valve. It's done some good. He also recognizes that there was some misunderstanding as he set out to do this. He says, I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out to be not a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. And if I don't stop writing that history at some quite arbitrary point, there's no reason why I should ever stop. So he's admitting that grief will go on and could go on forever. And he could go on writing about it forever as a result.
I did underline something in my book, David.
Yes.
It's just right here in 69.
Shame on you.
Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. That's a very interesting insight about
Yes.
what grief is like.
Yes. And so how does that benefit you as you come across that?
Well, because it's not so what am I trying to say? Expected. It's not so the same all the time. There's
Yeah.
bends and there's differences and things happen and you
Yes.
go with it, you know?
Yes. I can't hear Up and in the Road without thinking of Anne Shirley, especially with grief. You know, she had to put away some dreams. But you never know. There are bends in the road, and we never know what's around those corners.
You're referring to Anne of Green Gables.
I am. There are partial reoccurrences, but the sequence doesn't repeat. So I really liked, he said, okay, so if grief is a spiral, am I spiraling down or up? Right? So it's not just circular, it's spiraling. And I thought that was an important thought too, right? That, again, as we've already said, we can help ourselves or make ourselves descend further into our grief, or we can work at ascending out of our grief. And I wondered as I reflected on that myself, if maybe there's an ability to move in two ways at once, a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B, descending and ascending.
I think that when you're going through grief, it's not so much that you are, in fact, descending or ascending, as it is that you have a sense of which direction you're going in the long run.
Okay.
So some people seem to spiral down into their grief, and then eventually it becomes a physical disease. It becomes depression,
Right,
and it's no longer grief.
right,
It needs to be, it's a medically treatable disease.
right,
But some people anticipate, they know that they're in a horrible spot right now, but they do believe it's going to get better,
right.
and they move in that direction.
Okay,
Mm.
So
That's-
it's not so much a choosing or trying to push yourself in the right direction of grief.
right.
I think rather than it is just descriptive of the reality that most people or some people move in one direction and some people don't.
Yes. It's interesting. Is beginning to go back to his pre-married life in terms of the walking, so that he would go to bed tired. Every horizon, every style or clump of trees summon me into a past kind of happiness, my pre-age happiness. But the invitations seemed to me horrible. The happiness into which it invited me was insipid. I find that I don't want to go back again and be happy in that way. It frightens me to think that a mere going back should even be possible, for this fate would seem to me the worst of all. To reach a state in which my years of love and marriage should appear in retrospect a charming episode like a holiday that had briefly interrupted my interminable life and returned me to normal, unchanged. And then it would come to seem unreal, something so foreign to the usual texture of my history that I could almost believe it had happened to someone else. Thus, H would die to me a second time, a worse bereavement than the first. Anything but that. So that reminds me of, you've heard me talk about the Psalms and Walter Brueggemann's organizing of the Psalms into the three main categories of orientation, disorientation, reorientation. And reorientation is not the going back to the easy, happy days of yesterday, but is having traveled through the complexities, finds a new life. But it has gained the wisdom or the depth of the painful part of life. So it seems to me Lewis is describing maybe what we all are tempted to, right? To try and get back to Eden just directly, as opposed to having to go through the cross and the resurrection, death and our own resurrection.
I like that he brought out too in his journaling, his notes, that it included himself, H, and God.
Mhm.
And then he started to reflect upon that, the attributes of God. There was praise and there was joy.
Yes.
So the journaling, certainly took him to a good spot there.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where, again, the door became more open. It wasn't that slam shut, I'm knocking and nobody's there, nobody's hearing.
Yes.
That's where I think that broke through.
Isaiah, you mentioned journaling when your friend committed suicide,
Yeah,
that
Well,
you found it, that you found it helpful, or
I more wrote down my thoughts.
that's true. That's okay.
Journaling, sure. I found it beneficial. For comprehending like my own thoughts and processing them, and I'm a big reader, and one of my favorite writers, one of my earliest writings I read was the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and how he adapted through pain. And I thought if somebody like as prestigious as himself and like probably wouldn't other demonstrated like he had a perfect like he would have been worshipped in the streets and everything, and he still experienced pain. Like it made me really think of like how everyone experiences it and how it's not secluded to this individual person. And I allowed that to like that idea and reading and writing and like thinking of others and reading others walk through it allowed me not to be secluded in that
Yeah.
idea of like I'm still alone and suffering, but seeing other people walk the path
Yes.
and being like thankful to God that I walked that path. And like as a young child, I guess I never really got that happy place to go back to, because I've been clinically depressed and borderline disorder. Like my great grandma was in a asylum her whole life. Like my grandma is always medicated. My mom's always been medicated. My dad's been medicated. Like
Yeah.
it's not secluded to me, and I recognize that.
Yeah.
But that feeling of going through all those emotions and like losing siblings when I was younger too, like upheld an idea to me that like pain isn't secluded. And if you're gonna and you hold it to yourself so selfishly, like Jesus talks about that too, like being able to walk in other people's path. And lots of disciples question like Jesus' teaching and why he teaches to everyone, and recognizing that everyone needs God and Gentile too. You all struggle the same, and like
Mhm.
that was a really unthoughtful idea back in his day, because everybody, even nowadays, everybody just has what my mom likes to call it victim mentality of like, oh, woe is me. And I guess my mom's a very stern woman.
Yeah.
She's a very strong woman.
Now
So
this is being recorded. Did you want me to pause it?
no, no, it's good. She has made it like demonstrated like, hey, like writing these thoughts down allows you to process, but not like sit and become self-loathing
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
think about it in a less like, oh, what was me, like
Yeah.
getting down.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
writing for me was like a way to like process thoughts and think out loud for myself, but not like, I find when you think about it, you just get self-loathing.
Right. So it was a way for you to divest yourself of it, not to dwell on it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Good. Thanks.
that's the benefits I saw of it.
Thank you.
Do you two guys, you other two guys, see yourself as using this? Should you be faced in a similar kind of grieving situation? The reason I'm asking is because the only time in my life that I've ever journaled was in the months after Ron died. I have tried, I've bought beautiful journals and had lovely thoughts about how lovely it was going. I never did it. Except just that period, sort of, I think I started about 3 months after he died and probably wrote for till the end of the first year. And it's the only time. I've encouraged people to journal. I've told clients you should be journaling, but I've never done it myself because it's never worked.
For myself, I just don't know what I would use in terms of grief strategy. I think I do journal as part of my daily devotional,
Okay.
but I journal prayers. I don't really journal thoughts. So I expect I probably wouldn't journal that way, but I just don't know. I do find I gravitate more toward holy conversation. I seek out other men that I can talk to about things. And so I think I would be more likely to gravitate toward conversation with like my accountability partner, with my best friend, that kind of thing, as opposed and process with another person rather than just process on the page. And besides the conversation, I do a lot of processing mentally, and I expect that's probably where I would start is in my head a lot.
Yeah.
I find when I journal, the parts that I want to journal is when I hear God's voice and we have that, we're having a dialogue. When he says something, I want to hang on to what he says.
Right, right.
And then I want to write that down. And then, yeah, there's my thoughts start pulling into it, but what prompts me to journal is what he's telling.
Mhm.
So then it's not just, I said, well, I got to write something today. I've got to, like you say,
Right.
make something happen today,
Right, right.
it's the 18th. What am I going to write?
Yeah,
There's days where I write nothing.
yeah,
But then when I get it, then I got to put it down.
yeah. So it sounds like then for you, probably no, something were to happen to Karen, unless you were hearing God speaking into that situation for you, maybe you would write that down.
I don't know. I don't know what I would.
Yeah.
How do I know?
What would you want, Karen? Do you want him to journal or just find somebody else?
Close the book. No, we were talking about journaling and what the
Yeah.
significance and what would you do? And for me, those are the high points that
Yeah.
that's not, it was cloudy today and the
Yeah.
birds came in the backyard and,
Yeah.
and I had a conversation with Sam across the street.
Yeah.
It's something, I don't know.
Yeah.
Something more that strikes me, just
Yeah.
like Mary had said when she turned the corner and she seen that leaf.
Yeah,
And, I would probably have written that down.
yeah. Yeah,
There was something to, this wasn't an accident. This was something intentional. I will have to catch.
Yeah.
And I caught it.
yeah. So it seems to me that your answer would be very similar to mine in terms of Carol's question, in the event of losing my spouse, what I journal. I don't think I would do what Lewis did. But I might write something down.
Mine was a conversation with Ron.
Sorry.
Mine was a conversation with Ron.
Okay.
Cool.
It was 9 months of talking to him, telling him things. Not a dialogue. I didn't get any answers. But a sort of filling him in.
Yeah. I can't see myself doing that. I don't much commune with the dead. Like I don't visit graves. I don't
No, nor do I.
think I would keep ashes. I don't want to enshrine that. I find in myself a theology of I know I will see them again, and so I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied to say goodbye and to let go. But again, I've never had a relationship like I have with Sarah. So it's so hard from this place. I can't even imagine. I mean, I suppose I could imagine, but I just have no idea how that would bear in any kind of a reality. So, but I don't do it now, so I don't think I would do it then. Like I think Lewis was a writer. I think Lewis had the habit of thinking and writing those thoughts, communicating those thoughts to other people. I just do it differently. And so I think I would do it the way I do it now. It would just be about that then. I would just process differently.
I think for me, like I wrote down my thoughts I had like before I lost Wyatt, and like I can read this, but then like I can tell like I just write down my thoughts like that I think in that moment, and like I can read this one. This is like when I see the date and it's like after Wyatt, I wrote like the greatest loss is when the part of them they planted within us passes away when they die. Let the memories shine like gold in your heart and illustrate past joys and hope for the future. And like that's just like a thought I had in that moment.
Mhm.
But it's just like quickly on my phone, and then it's like, then it's done.
Right.
Then it's like
Yeah.
done for that.
Yeah.
Leave it.
Yeah.
And I would think C.S. Lewis was in a similar, like, he thought it, wrote it down, just like
Right.
it's the way to just
Yeah.
leave it there.
Right.
I agree with that.
And he certainly seemed to review, what he had written, a couple of times he says, I've been reading what I wrote. It's horrific stuff. I can't believe I said that stuff. That might actually be one of the reasons why I wouldn't write something down. Too self-critical.
He did, that triggers what you were just saying about, you probably would carry on in a way similar to what you do now. And it made me think about when he's talking about his encounter with age,
Yeah.
and that it's intellect and intelligence. And
Yeah.
that in the end, he thinks that, that's what will be distilled to, as it were.
Right. Yeah.
And what struck me with that is he's an intellectual,
Right.
an academic. And so it's not surprising that he would envision her that way, experience her that way. I mean, and based on references he made to her character earlier,
Yes.
they were very much similar
Yes.
that way.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but I thought that was interesting that, he's still with his peer group, as it were.
Yeah. And she was similar, but also different. Like, I think that was part of again, that kind of gets highlighted in Shadowlands. He's used to kind of being the lecturer, the teacher, the professor, and he makes a statement in the movie and she just kind of answers him back and counters him. And he's kind of flat-footed at first because he's not used to that. And so there's this wonderful challenge. She doesn't let him get away with things.
Right.
Partly because she's American, right? So there's that brassiness to her. Sorry, you were saying something.
No, keep going.
So there is the similarity of intellect. She was intellectual. She was sharp. But like all good marriages, she was also different intellect. And because of that, she was not a yes person. She wasn't overwhelmed by his great mind. There was real fodder for communion there because she had her own mind, and the wonderfulness was her ability to challenge him. And together they became more as a result.
I just found it was interesting how he closed that chapter with him talking about the dead, and the dead can see us in the resurrection, and what does that mean? And because that's such a awesome picture of hope and beauty. If the dead actually see it, that kind of makes you think when you're walking each day and you're thinking of the loved ones that have gone. What are they seeing? What are they seeing in me? So it's really, I don't know, it brought out for me a real sobering feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't want H to be seeing him as, this, what would he think of that she was seeing? Well, he wants her to see everything. I don't want anything hidden.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting how he tried to bring that out about the resurrection and the dead. And he didn't want to just pass it over. She's dead. Where is she? Yes, she's in a different place.
Yes.
But she sees, she's alive.
I really liked on 75 in my version. It doesn't matter that all the photographs of H are bad. It doesn't matter, not much, if my memory of her is imperfect. Images, whether on paper or in the mind, are not important for themselves, merely links. Take a parallel from an infinitely higher sphere. Tomorrow morning, a priest will give me a little round, thin, cold, tasteless wafer. Is it a disadvantage? Is it not in some ways an advantage that it can't pretend the least resemblance to that with which it unites me? So now he's saying, okay, like at one point in the earlier chapters, he says, I can't bring her to mind, whereas I can bring the stranger to mind. Now he's saying, actually, that might not be a bad thing, because again, there's the awful habit of replacing the actual thing with the image. And maybe there's value in the distorted image in order to make sure that I'm really grasping onto the real thing.
And I think, didn't he use the parallel that it's like an icon?
Yes,
You're worshiping
yes.
something that's,
And just to make sure, when he talks about God being the great iconoclast,
Yeah.
that is idol smasher.
Mhm.
So again, similar to the knocking the house of cards over. We set up the idols, God comes through and smashes those images for us. And again, it's grace. All reality is iconoclastic. The earthly beloved, even in this life, that means Sarah, insistently triumphs over your mere idea of her. And you want her to. You want her with all her resistances, all her faults, all her unexpectedness. I mean, the Hallmark cards just write themselves. That is in her foursquare and independent reality. And this, not an image or memory, is what we are to love still after she is dead. The real person. So that kind of ties in with what he said in the first couple of chapters. We can make an image of our grief. Oh, she wouldn't like this, she wouldn't like that. And suddenly she becomes a thin veneer for what I really want.
I think too, in society, I just things running through my mind, don't speak ill of the dead. Other things like that. Like
Yes.
I think the societal norm is to actually gloss over that image or gloss over that reality
Right,
and put on it the best face possible
right. Yeah. So talk
and
about that.
only remember them that way.
Tease that out. Why has society done that? What's the benefit that they think they're establishing?
I don't really know.
Doesn't have
I
to be
think it's just
you.
it's easier or more personal in that, when I die, people will think well of me and
Right.
forget the bad things or
Right. I wonder if part of it is the idea of resting in peace. Now that they're gone, raking up this stuff disturbs the peace. Death in some ways has established the great peace. There's no more debate. There's no
Yep.
argument. Rehashing the awfulness of this person doesn't allow the dead to rest and all of that stuff with it. You know what I mean? Am I?
Yeah, I get that. I
what
get
I'm
that.
saying?
Yeah.
Um,
I can see people thinking that way.
and in some ways, it's not fair. The dead can't defend themselves, right? I think that's another aspect of, my grandmother, my mom's mom was a hard lady, And there's been family gatherings where we've rehearsed some of the moments over our lifetime. And
Mm.
some point my uncle would say, all right, we're not here to bash my mother, kind of thing, right? Dead can't defend themselves.
Yeah.
And so maybe somebody has to stand up for them. So maybe it's the desire to show grace, recognizing that we'll also need that same level of grace,
Yes.
Or like a respect piece, like
respect. Yeah.
no one's perfect and like we
That's
recognize that.
Yeah.
And that disrespecting like someone's imperfections. Like I don't think anybody here can say that they've lived like a perfect life or anything. And so disrespecting people after they pass away, like their imperfections is a way of.
So in Screw Tape Letters, Lewis talks about the devil always comes in pairs. I like to think in terms of ditches. What are the ditches that we need to avoid? And I wonder if both ditches we need to be aware of, right? The false veneer of giving the dead a reputation they didn't earn, right? And so therefore leaving behind a false person or holding on to a false person is not a benefit, but at the same time, raking it all up and just letting them have it after they're dead, painting them with the worst brushes is maybe just as false. So somewhere in the middle. And it kind of reminds me, even in our living relationships, right? If we have on one axis candor to fully truthful to deceptive or a lie, and on the other, so you got truth, and then you have love. You know, the quadrant we really want to be in is caring candor, to love somebody fully and to be fully truthful. One without the other, truth without love is just awful.
It's a weapon.
And love without truth is just sloppy. It's sentimentality. But truthful candor or caring candor is the determination both to tell the truth and to tell the truth in love. And so maybe that's where we need to end up with even those who have gone in order to enjoy the peace that Christ has established.
Mhm.
And I suppose maybe that's why Jesus says, judge not lest ye be judged in the same way. With the same weights and measures.
That's the part that always got to me. The same measure. Uh-oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Better watch out.
Yeah. So beware what scales you're using.
Yes, exactly.
They're going to be used for you too.
Yeah. And it's a good deterrent, actually, for me, anyway.
Yeah. Now this is something, and again, we'll see this in Great Divorce on 79. Am I, for instance, just sidling back to God because I know that if there's any road to H, it runs through him. But then, of course, I know perfectly well that he can't be used as a road. If you're approaching him, not as the goal, but as a road, not as the end, but as a means, you're not really approaching him at all. That's what was really wrong with all those popular pictures of happy reunions on the farther shore. Not the simple-minded and very earthly images, but the fact that they make an end of what we can get only as a byproduct of the true end. And so we will see that in screw tape letters, right? There's one woman that says, well, that's fine, I'll do whatever I have to do to have my son back. And that means I need to go with you and come before God, that I will. So let's get on with it so I can have my son. And her ghost or spirit has to say, can't you see that you can't get on that way? You can never, only by desiring God more and Michael less can you have them both. And so that's what he talks about. I think it was in Mere Christianity, the order of first things first and second things second. If we try and put secondary things into the primary place, we will lose the joy of both. But if we can enjoy the primary thing and the secondary thing in the proper order, then we'll have the pleasure of both. It's important. Although I thought his final question in that paragraph was good. Consider, Lord, how it looks to us. What would anyone think of me if I said to the boys, no toffee now, but when you've grown up and don't really want toffee, you shall have as much of it as you choose. He's got a point.
Mhm.
But there's also, we're running out of time, so there's also this idea that flashed in my mind and went away again. Oh, it's gone. Sorry, guys. No toffee now, but when you've grown up and
You'll
don't,
come back.
shall have as much of it as you choose. Oh, the answers, that's right. These things that seem like riddles or nonsense, the reframing, that peace child, you don't understand. Nonsense questions are unanswerable. And so the probability that when we get to heaven and ask the questions, we'll really find out the answers that in our current animalistic minds, we can't resolve the conflict, but there must be a way that God is going to answer them that demonstrates there never was a conflict. It just appeared a conflict to us. And it kind of reminds me of what we'll see in Till We Have Faces, which is my absolute favorite. That's why I saved it for the end. Where the main character says, how can we face the gods until we have faces? But now that I come to think of it, there's no practical problem before me at all. I
Mhm.
need the two great commandments, and I better get on with them. Indeed, H's death has ended the practical problem. While she was alive, I could, in practice, have put her before God. That is, could have done what she wanted instead of what he wanted. If there'd been a conflict, what's left is not a problem about anything I could do. It's all about weights of feelings and motives and that sort of thing. It's a problem I'm setting myself. I don't believe God set it me at all. I think that's interesting.
The great aha of heaven.
Right. Did you understand the difficulty he was having on 82? The mystical union on the one hand, the resurrection of the body on the other? It's on the bottom of 82 in mine. So the mystical union is that we are to be taken up into the very nature of God. For Lewis, and theologically, say God is infinite, which means he is without a body, which is why he's omnipresent. And on the other hand, so to be taken up in a mystical union would indicate we become like him, disembodied or infinite. And yet, on the other hand, we have the resurrection of the body, which is clearly attested to in Scripture. But part of his thing is, I don't know how these two things are going to work together.
Mm.
In my understanding of them.
When Moses was on the mountain, God appeared to him
Yeah.
bodily.
Yes.
So that's
that was-
a mystery. We don't know how, but it
Yeah.
was.
So that's a theophany, an appearance of God in the form of something that we understand, but that is not God in his infinite reality. That was God communicating himself in a way. So what you're saying is valid, and that did happen, but that doesn't resolve Lewis's question of how these two promises of the future are going to work together.
Well, when Jesus came back and walked, in his resurrection, again, there was that example.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was written for us to see that he did have a body. He
Yes.
came, he
Yeah.
walked with us. And whether Lewis has got it figured out or not, that's going to be for all,
Yes.
for all of us
Yeah,
to
yeah,
come
yeah.
to agreement with.
And Lewis agrees with you.
Yeah.
He's just not sure how the two things are going to
How does it
reconcile.
work?
Yeah.
How does it work?
Yeah. Although
Heaven will solve our problems.
I think when you point to Jesus, though, you're a lot closer to the answer.
Yeah.
Right? Because this in Christ, we're resurrected in Christ, and we are in the mystical union with God in
Right.
Christ.
Only in
So
Christ.
to me, that's the answer.
Yeah.
And I tend to push back here on Lewis, the idea of God as the great mind, such a disembodied notion. I think at times he tends towards a more Gnostic view. So he has material and spiritual as two distinct categories. And I think Scripture, the Hebrew mind, because Lewis is working through a Greek mind, but the Hebrew mind doesn't have a challenge with these things. And I think, so I don't think we become like God in that way. Yeah. But someday we'll know, and Lewis knows now.
Yeah,
He's watching us
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
gone on before us. Yeah.
He's watching us.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know that, all the mystery, but he's got less mysteries than we do.
He's liking what he sees.
Yeah, yeah. I like this. You mentioned it earlier. It is often thought that the dead see us, and we assume, whether reasonably or not, that if they see us at all, they see us more clearly than before. Does H now see exactly how much froth and tinsel there was in what she called and I call my love? So be it. Look your hardest, dear. I wouldn't hide if I could. We didn't idealize each other. We tried to keep no secrets. You knew most of the rotten places in me already. If you now see anything worse, I can take it. So can you. Rebuke, explain, mock, forgive, for this is one of the great miracles of love. He gives to both, but perhaps especially to the woman. So here we have some sense of sexism, a power of seeing through its own enchantments and yet not being disenchanted. So I think that he's giving a description of marriage, and he's talked about the marriage not ending. even at death. So there's another point where I tend to disagree with him, while at the same time understanding, I think I understand what he's trying to say and appreciate what he's saying.
It's, I struggle with it when we come to texts like, there is no male nor female, slave nor free
Okay,
in heaven.
yeah.
How you can then pull back to, oh, well, mother is watching me.
Right,
And I think every time Lewis comes up against something that some theologians would label mystery, he kind of springs back a bit and gets really feely, like touchy. Things I can touch, things I can understand.
yeah. Yeah, well, he's certainly not, the fact that something is a mystery doesn't mean for him or for me, when it comes to that, that we don't think about them, we don't talk about them, that we don't try and understand them. Because again, even Paul, when he talks about this is a mystery, this is not something that's hidden and unknowable. This is the thing that was previously hidden and not known and has now been revealed and made known to us. And so there's this revelation of the mystery, doesn't resolve everything, but it's at least appreciable that we can understand some measure of it and celebrate it. And the time spent dwelling on the mystery, even how, the relationship between the wafer and the impartation of the very presence of Christ, that's a mystery, but Lewis can spend some time and really celebrate that in taking this tasteless, cold, thin, cardboard-like wafer, I am somehow encountering the real presence of Christ being imputed to me. And so there is both the holding on to the mystery as well as thinking about the mystery and appreciating what's going on. And I think he's doing the same thing with marriage. The reality that here's a person that sees me and goes on seeing me, and reveals me to myself while they mock, rebuke, explain, forgive. And that seeing of me doesn't diminish their capacity to love me, but increases it somehow. To see all the ugly spots doesn't make her flee, but draws her further towards me. That's a mystery. And I think he's celebrating.
Perhaps if Paul had married, he and Lewis would have even more in common.
Maybe.
But I give Lewis credit. He didn't skirt away from it, like you said. He brought it up because it was there.
Yes.
And I respect him for that. Instead of others would just close it off and not have any element of saying, well, what is resurrection? What is heaven? What does that mean?
Right.
Where are the dead?
Yes.
He took it on.
Yes.
So good on him.
Yeah. And I mean, while I don't agree with him on every point, I mean, he's still to me extremely helpful. And to me, there's a lot of good in what he writes, and helpful is probably the best category I can give. Woo, 8:30. Any last thing that you just have to say about this all?
What does the last quote in the book say?
I have no idea. You mean the Latin? Poi si torno al eterna fontana.
You're too busy studying Greek.
Yeah, I have no idea what that says. You can probably Google it.
Yeah. I'm at peace with God. She smiled, but not at
Yeah.
me.
Yeah,
Maybe that means I am at peace with God.
maybe. So didn't people dispute once whether the final vision of God was more an act of intelligence or of love? That is probably another of the nonsense questions. So that reminds me of, the Catholic Church has the beatific vision that, the heavenly experiences, I will see God as he sees me. For the reformers, it was, I will know God, we will know God as he knows me. And for Wesley, it was love. I will love God as he loves me. And in each of those, it's the perfection, right? That is the perfecting that is happening. And in my books, and I think that's what Lewis is saying there too, that it's one of those nonsense questions. There's no division. I think we will see, know, and love as we are seen, known, and loved, as one act, all one and the same thing. Okay, I'm gonna stop this.
Not separated by sin.
Not separated by sin. That's right. Yeah.